Writing to the New York Times during the World Series in 1933, actor and observer of the American scene, Will Rogers said, "These announcers of the World Series in both the radio systems did a great job. I got a radio in my stable. Well, they made it seem so real that half a dozen times I started into a box stall to buy a hot dog and a bottle of beer. I liked the way they announced where the batter come from, his hometown, his weight, age, batting average, and who he had been keeping company with. And that's what should be done with radio singers. This crooner is from Adenoid, New Jersey. He sings left-handed, weighs 118 pounds with his tonsils. He sang 335 songs last year with nothing to remember him by but his manuscript. He was first with Claremore, Oklahoma in the OK League, divorced 3 times, and is looking for a break. Yours, Will Rogers." It's fascinating to note that nothing has changed when it comes to baseball broadcasting. For me, the quintessential example of informational overkill that Will Rogers seems to have been responding to, at least informational overkill compared to what he was used to, which was nothing. Baseball on the radio being a relatively new thing, the language of the effort was still being figured out. But for me, you have to go back to the career of catcher Mike Piazza. It happened at least 1,956 times, because at least once in every single game that Piazza played, every one, the broadcasters felt obligated, not sure which side, so maybe we could multiply this by 2. Maybe it was more like 3,900 times if it was both sides. It's just that Vin Scully was the announcer for a lot of those games, and I trust that Vin Scully had more discretion here. Every game, we should maybe count pre- and post-game hosts as well. Every game, someone mentioned that Piazza was drafted in the 62nd round as a favor to Godfather Tommy Lasorda. Every single time. Now that happened, that draft, in 1988. Piazza reached the majors in 1992 and played until 2007. So even nearly 20 years after the fact, we still had to be reminded of that, even though we never had a chance to forget it. That total, 1,956, includes regular season, postseason, and all-star games, but doesn't include exhibitions and cannot account for the possibility that in some games, the broadcasters fell back on that story more than once. Maybe in extra innings, they felt like it had been refreshed and they could go back to it. For me, growing up in the New York area, this was my second trip down low draft pick road. I got a low-key preview of the Piazza story during the height of Don Mattingly's career, when in about 1/3 of his games, and again, I cannot account for both sides of the broadcast. Maybe the opposition's broadcasters hit this even more often, but you would hear about 1/3 of the time that the Yankees had selected Mattingly in the 19th round of the 1979 draft, and oh my God, what a steal. How badly had this guy been overlooked and disrespected? And this was irritating because, first, as with Piazza, we got it. We heard you the first 9,000 times. The other part of it was it just wasn't true. Yes, Mattingly was kind of a little guy. He had small stature compared to some of the giants who played baseball. Seeing him stand next to Dave Winfield, you would never be confused as to which of the two was the more likely to be selected as a model for a statue of a classic Greek discus thrower or something. That said, he was a 19th round pick, not necessarily because he was a little guy and scouts wanted to buy low on him, but because, first of all, in the 1970s and 80s, there were creatures with tentacles sucking on rocks on Mars that cared more about the amateur draft than the Yankees did. So if he landed with them, it was not as the result of pure insight. They were just throwing darts at the wall. And secondly, he was actually a pretty well-regarded high school player, but teams thought he was going to college, so why blow a pick higher up when you can get someone who actually is going to sign with you? There was so much less to that Mattingly story than his being underestimated, and long before the 16 years of his career had passed, it had become more than tedious. It had become oppressive. Maybe just to give certain broadcasters the benefit of the doubt, they really felt like there would have been someone out there who just hadn't heard those Mattingly or Piazza stories. But having said that, having admitted that possibility, if you listen to or watch enough baseball, You can tell which broadcasters really enjoy their jobs, which are over it, just like the rest of us, and which over or under prepare, just like the rest of us. One now broken up radio team I listened to, was kind of forced to listen to for a long time, could often be heard to exclaim, "We've got to change for the 7th. The Red Sox have just inserted Luke Bongibong at shortstop. I've never heard of this guy. Have you heard of him, Ralph?" "No. It's a mystery to me." And of course, the correct response to this, if you're sitting at home in your chair, relaxing, listening to the ballgame, is, "Oh yeah? Well, so's your mother." My friends, my dear friends, it's your job to look at the roster before the game and figure out just who the hell Luke Bongibong is, because your listeners probably haven't heard of him either, and it falls to you to inform them. Worse, sometimes they would say this not about the team's 98th best prospect, who is really not a prospect at all, but still germane, still relevant. Why? Because he's on the field right now, and he just might get the game-winning hit. Imagine if Luke Bongibong walks it off with a grand slam, and you're in the position of doing an old Lone Ranger broadcast. "Who was that masked man?" "I don't know, but I think he goes by Bongibong. I didn't even get the chance to thank him." Well, that's because no one had identified him for you. Not every fan has the capability, the time, the money, the energy to follow the minor leagues the way that someone who is engaged in talking about baseball should. You do it for them, not only because you love it, but so they don't have to. And I was about to say, sometimes it's not the journeyman in the organization that gets the whole treatment, but rather the team's second or third or fourth best prospect. And that was really frustrating because all of baseball has been watching this guy, at least to some extent, except the people paid to watch him and talk about him. And be aware that Luke Bongibong is a comer. He was a first-round draft pick 2 years ago. He was hurt right after being drafted, so some people wrote him off. But last year, he won the Sally League batting title, has jumped up 2 levels this year, and presently leads the International League in home runs. There's a big industry around that kind of information nowadays. It's pretty easy to come by. And you know the funny part? Somewhere on some broadcast on September 8th, 1982, I don't know who it was, I don't know if it was on television or radio, but someone said, "We go to the bottom of the 9th, Yankees ahead 10-2. Ken Griffey has come out. Don Mattingly has taken over in right field." Who? Don Mattingly? I've never heard of that guy. Now extrapolate this same concept of over-preparing, under-preparing, of sedulous study and detached indolence, of just phoning it in, to commentators in every other field, including those who we rely upon to explain what's really happening in our world. You know, it's funny, I happened to come across this half anecdote about old Dodgers manager Wilbert Robinson this week. Uncle Robbie and his scout, Spencer Abbott, were having a discussion during which Abbott felt called upon, and I'm quoting here from the original story, to assert in a loud tone, "Even in baseball, truth is mighty—" "Yes, sir," interrupted Uncle Wilbert, "mighty scarce. So who can you trust? Yourself, but only if you listen carefully to discern who is checked in and who's checked out. If you don't, the one who's checked out might be you, having turned in your key and been misled into enlisting in the gray army of the infinite inning." Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 351. I am, as always, your non-confrontational, how's that for a change up on convivial, host, Stephen Goldman, as ever, for this trip to the past, on a mission to better understand the present, the vehicle being the national pastime, the game of baseball. Now, I am coming to you prior to the World Series, or really, and try not to picture this, we're sort of straddling it, in that I'm recording the bulk of this episode beforehand, prior to the evening of October 31st and Game 6. And so I have no idea if the thing will end tonight or if we will get a 7th game. And I'm kind of rooting for the 7th game. Not kind of. I am. The winters are long and cold, and there is vanishingly little baseball in it. At least we get so much more baseball information now during the off season than we used to. When I first started out writing about baseball professionally, people would ask me, "So are you still employed during the winter?" They didn't realize. They had to be told, "Oh yeah, it's a year-round thing." But it wasn't always like that. I mean, if you subscribe to the sporting news, back in the day, they covered it year-round. And if you were lucky enough to have access to the Boston Globe during the 80s and 90s, Peter Gammons would put out about weekly, not every week. Sometimes it was really disappointing because it wasn't easy for me to get hold of the Boston Globe in New Jersey at that time, before everything was online. He would put out, as I've said many times, a whole page of broadsheet filled with rumors, most of which did not come to fruition, but they tided you over. And I don't know if you'll recall this, but for a while, I'm not sure for how many years, Pepsi, or maybe it was Pizza Hut, or both, because I think one owned the other at one point. Pepsi owned Pizza Hut, sponsored a softball game just before spring training began, so towards the end of January, which starred then current major leaguers. And that was so close to the real thing. I went to that like a junkie just to see Wade Boggs pop up a softball to a roamer would do something to satisfy my need to have the game back again. And this was at about the same time that Collusion was throttling the Hot Stove League, so boy, were we thirsty. I have a lot to say to you in Act 2 of the show today, so I'm going to progress quickly through this segment. This week, I talked about managerial follies in the World Series, that's at Baseball Prospectus, and specifically Bucky Harris's decision to intentionally walk a batter who was suffering from vertigo and torn ankle ligaments in Game 4 of the 1947 World Series, a decision that led directly to a Yankees loss. I didn't quite finish my thought before, vis-a-vis straddling, that I will wrap up the episode after the game concludes, and by then, we'll know whether we get more baseball or not, and I will be able to briefly remark upon that at the very end of the program, which again, I have a lot to say in the second act, so I won't need to add more, but I might. A quick promotional note last week, a report from the environmental group Coffee Watch, and I'm not making fun of that, pointed out that Brazil is increasingly deforesting itself to grow more coffee, yet the climate change that results from us murdering the planet's lungs, not to put too fine a point on it, makes it harder to grow coffee. Coffee essentially punched a Honduras-sized hole in Brazilian forests, said Etel Higanet, Coffee Watch's founder and director, to NPR. And that's why I agreed to endorse afueracoffee.com on this program, because not only do I sincerely love coffee, I sincerely love air. I love the rainforest. I love creatures like the loris, which lives in the rainforest. They live in Southeast Asian rainforests, not Brazilian rainforests, but they were the first rainforest critter that came to mind, so forgive me. How about the sloth? I dig sloths. And since Afuera Coffee sources its beans from Rainforest Alliance certified farms, I'm hopeful that no sloths were harmed in the production of this brew. I'd like to think that in this small way, we're at least supporting responsible capitalism versus a business that turns orphans into chimney sweeps and then runs away when they get stuck in the flu. Poor Timmy. Screw him, the clumsy oaf. Chimney. If you go to afueracoffee.com and type in Infinite Inning at checkout, you'll get 15% off those wholesome beans. And by the way, yesterday on this week's reissue episode, I mentioned an old radio show, the Chase and Sanborn Hour, starring Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. It was actually a good show. First of all, it's where the Bickersons came from, which was kind of a sketch within it, which became its own thing. It starred Don Amici and Francis Langford as a married couple that just despise each other. And if you don't get enough of that in your own life, then, well, I guess you might find that sort of thing entertaining. Second of all, Edgar Bergen was not the world's greatest ventriloquist. He was funny, but he moved his lips a lot. So radio was really the perfect environment for him. Can I share a very dumb thing I think about sometimes? This is the kind of trivia that obsesses me. In the 70s, there were a couple of dumb superhero-themed specials on NBC that were not written like true comic book stories. They were written like bad vaudeville shows with creaky old mother-in-law jokes and that sort of thing. And they were called The Legends of the Superheroes. They did bring back Adam West and Burt Ward, although they put the Batman costume on West wrong, which has always driven me nuts. But on one of those specials, when I was a very little kid, I heard Burt Ward and Adam West do this joke. It's sort of a funny joke. And then years later, through the time machine of radio, I heard it again, done on an episode of the Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy radio show, the Chase and Sanborn Hour, which was roughly 30 to 35 years older than the Batman and Robin thing that I just described to you. And what I wonder is, did they originate it, their writers? Or is it just ancient? So ancient that it's kind of authorless because whoever originally came up with the gag has been lost to time. But it involves a car. It involves borrowing a car. In the Batman and Robin version, Robin has borrowed the Batmobile. In the Charlie and Edgar version, Charlie apologizes to Edgar for borrowing his car and having a slight accident with it. "Well, where did you leave it?" Edgar asks. "Between 5th and 8th, Charlie replies. "Well, where between 5th and 8th? "All the way between 5th and 8th. Big laugh. I laughed when they did it. I didn't laugh at Adam West and Burt Ward, unfortunately, but then the whole thing kind of made me mad. I'm a purist, you see. The whole reason I bring this up is I did go back to the Chase and Sanborn Coffee Hour to see how they handled their ads, since I'm now in the world of this sort of sponsorship and you're in the world of listening to it. I want to at least make it entertaining for you, but I was disappointed because they just handled it like straight ads. And in fact, the main ad that I heard was actually for a non-coffee product, Tenderleaf Tea Balls. I think ballin' the tea was a wartime expedient, but either way, it sounded almost indistinguishable from a Lucky Strike ad of the period where they talked about buying only the finest leaves. Speaking of ads, it is time for us to take a break. On the other side, we get to encounter synchronicity, which is a strange force. It's good when it happens, but not so good when it happens for bad reasons. When something negative is happening, that crosses over into my little ambit here, that corner of the multiverse we call the infinite inning, and baseball and the way baseball used to be intersects with the way we live now. There's this little fission that takes place when that happens, at least for me. On the other side, we go back to 1933 because of things that are happening now. On Friday, October 31st, two different federal judges enjoined our duly elected government from as a supposed consequence of our current constitutional crisis. Said crisis being that the Constitution has been poisoned, murdered, killed, abandoned in the alley, and Congress has abdicated from shutting off SNAP, which is not a baseball acronym standing for Support Neutral Adjusted Pitching, but rather the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which used to be called, in a less sensitive time, unofficially, food stamps. It is meant to ensure that those who cannot work, or who cannot work at a high enough rate of pay, do not go hungry. The government has a rainy day fund established for just this purpose, for just this sort of emergency, but the lords and ladies at court do not want to use it, saying, let them eat ballroom. Now, assuming the lords and ladies honor the court orders, people who most need help will continue to receive it, at least to some extent. Stay tuned, because you can't take anything for granted these days. There are 42 million Americans who receive SNAP. A lot of people demagogue that number and ask, how is it we have so many people on this program? Some of them must be stealing. It's pretty simple. This is a country of about 335 million to 340 million people. The poverty rate is a shocking 12.5% or so. 12% of 340 million is 42 million. Maybe smaller numbers would make it easier to imagine the number of us who are on this program. The current seating capacity of Dodger Stadium is 56,000 people. If you watched any of the 3 World Series games prior to this evening's, then every time the camera showed a crowd shot, you were seeing some portion of 56,000 people. If that crowd were representative of the American public, and of course it isn't because the World Series is an expensive ticket, but stay with me, then 49,000 of the attendees would have incomes at least a little above the poverty level, and 7,000 would not, or at least wouldn't be too far above it. Remember, one can qualify for assistance if they have an income at or below 130% of the federal poverty level for their household, which is a tacit acknowledgement that the poverty level is set too low. As for their stealing, quote unquote, it's not a lot of money. According to a recent New York Times article, it comes to about $356 a month per household. That's on average. Some are more, some are less. Multiplying that by 12, you get $4,272 a year. If my numbers are off, you'll tell me, but that works out to $12 a day. You think anyone's laughing all the way to the bank on $12 a day? I also want to share a good line about another aspect, well, several lines, regarding an aspect of nutritional assistance which has often been demagogued. And here I want to quote from the great leftist writer Meridel Lesueur, who wrote a piece of reportage, a very good piece about women trying to find jobs in the depths of the Great Depression. It was 1932. The piece was titled Women on the Breadlines, and spoiler, you didn't find women on the breadlines. I've often wondered about that because there are plenty of pictures of men lining up for soup kitchens and the like. You don't see a lot of women, and that is addressed in her story, and the different sorts of shame that women felt compared to men that prevented them from seeking that sort of assistance. In Women on the Breadline, she profiles a bunch of women of all ages sitting in a jobs office at the YWCA, hoping against hope they would just get some kind of position that would keep them whole. Now, one of the things we have often heard over the years about SNAP recipients is that they were taking advantage of the program either by eating too well or eating too poorly. They can't win either way. And what I mean by that is that Ronald Reagan, for example, going back to his first run for president, attempted to stigmatize people of color who were recipients by saying that they were getting prime rib and lobster on food stamps. Conversely, you often hear that people are buying too much junk food with their nutritional support. And in this passage from Women on the Breadlines, she addresses both of those accusations in a sense as if they were true, which obviously they generally are not. But the, pardon the expression, flavor of this particular emergency had a particular effect on the recipient of funds for buying food, a psychological effect. And I have no reason to believe that that's changed. And I want to also include the conclusion to that section of her story because she talks about one of the hazards of not having sufficient funds to eat. These are knock-on effects of degradation that you'd think a moral society would care more about. She wrote, "Sitting here waiting for a job, the women have been talking in low voices about the girl, Ellen. They talk in low voices with not too much pity for her, unable to see through the mist of their own torment. What happened to Ellen? One of them asks. She knows the answer already. We all know it. A young girl who went around with Ellen tells about seeing her last evening back of a cafe downtown, outside the kitchen door, showing her legs so that the cook came out and gave her some food, and some men gathered in the alley and threw small coin on the ground for a look at her legs. And the girl says enviously that Ellen had a swell breakfast and treated her to one too, that cost $2. A scrub woman, whose hips are bent forward from stooping with hands gnarled like water-soaked branches, clicks her tongue in disgust. No one saves their money, she says. A little money and these foolish young things buy a hat, $1 for breakfast, a bright scarf. And they do. If you've ever been without money or food, something very strange happens when you get a bit of money, a kind of madness. You don't care. You can't remember that you had no money before, that the money will be gone. You can remember nothing but that there is the money for which you have been suffering. Now here it is. A lust takes hold of you. You see food in the windows. In imagination, you can eat hugely. You taste 1,000 meals. You look in the windows. Colors are brighter. You buy something to dress up in. An excitement takes hold of you. You know it is suicide, but you can't help it. You must have food. Dainty, splendid food. And a bright hat. So once again, you feel blithe. rid of that ratty, gnawing shame. I guess she'll go on the street now, a thin woman says faintly, and no one takes the trouble to comment further. Like every commodity now, the body is difficult to sell, and the girls say you're lucky if you get 50 cents. It's very difficult and humiliating to sell one's body. Perhaps it would make it clear if one were to imagine having to go out on the street to sell, say, one's overcoat. Suppose you have to sell your coat so you can have breakfast and a place to sleep, say for 50 cents. You decide to sell your only coat. You take it off and put it over your arm. The street, that has before been just a street, now becomes a mart, something entirely different. You must approach someone and admit you are destitute and are now selling your clothes, your most intimate possessions. Everyone will watch you talking to the stranger, showing him your overcoat, what a good coat it is. People will stop and watch curiously. You will be quite naked on the street. It is even harder to sell oneself, more humiliating. It is even humiliating to try to sell one's labor when there is no buyer. I want to talk about why we have these programs. Food assistance goes back to the 1930s, when Meridel Lesueur wrote that piece, and it has been the subject of attack pretty much since day one, because someone somewhere might be cheating and getting something for nothing, even though that nothing is just $12 a day. And let's just get that part out of the way. In a country that's so large, a nation of millions, even back in the 1930s, sure, over time there have been cheats, but as a percentage of recipients, they would be insignificant, and you would find them in every ethnic or religious group. In every population, definitionally, there are people of above average or below average ethics and morality, and patriotism too. And of course, there's all kinds of cheating. If you avoid your income tax, if you pay less than you should have, then you are scamming the government and betraying your fellow citizen in the precise same way that someone who is taking too much out of the snap trough is scamming and betraying them. Although your proportions of doing so are probably higher, given that if you're not in that latter bucket, you are probably making more money than they are. Are you making more than $12 a day? So let he or she or they among us who are without sin cast the first stone. From my point of view, let's feed people first and means test them later, investigate them to your heart's content, because you can always stop a cheater from cheating a second time, but you can't repair the damage done to a child via malnutrition. As Miss Lesueur wrote in 1932, you can't feed a child cream tomorrow to make up for his not having milk today. And that was from a separate piece on the same subject. There are a lot of children on supplemental nutrition, a lot of old folks who are past the age of retirement, and a lot of members of the working poor, which is to say people who have jobs, but the job doesn't pay. That's a lyric, isn't it? Now I've got a job, but it don't pay. Yeah, it's the Clash. It's trained in vain. So alone I keep the wolves at bay. But you don't keep them at bay without 3 squares and maybe some meaty treats to throw at those canines. Actually, we're going to get back to that thought. It was the administration's goal, our current administration's, to cut funds for this program, but with Republicans and Democrats unable to agree on a budget because the administration and its party also wants to undercut health care, and in any case, they have reneged on many other aspects of budget agreements in which the White House has impounded funds illegally. The government is closed. There is literally no incentive for the Democrats to make a deal when the administration's word is not worth a damn thing. Weirdly, the Speaker of the House is keeping his half of Congress closed too, and the Constitution and the way the House has been run historically sets the Speaker up to be a very powerful man in some instances, and at some times more powerful than the president. The current speaker isn't interested in all that. He doesn't want to work at all. He's a lot like that imaginary welfare recipient they're always talking about. And so, prior to today's court orders, SNAP benefits were scheduled to stop as of November 1st, and again, we're not out of the woods yet. Let's talk about when this program arrived. It arrived at a moment of inspiration that struck concurrently with the 1933 World Series, which, by another coincidence, happened to be held in Washington, the last time that would happen until 2019. 86 years. Long time for Washington fans to go without. And that gap from 1933 to 2019 and the extinction of Washington in this narrow sense That is the point of this juxtaposition. Things wouldn't be the same again, in ways both good and bad. I'm not going to punch hard on that. I'm not going to underscore it for you every time I show you an example from that time and say, well, it's not like that anymore. I'll do it once. I'll maybe do it twice. I'll try to resist it the rest of the time because I'm confident I know that you will see it for yourself. It was, to borrow from a Star Wars title crawl, a dark time for the Republic. The Great Depression had brought the world economy to a halt amidst a deflationary spiral and a credit crunch. Individual Americans were broke. Cities were broke. Chicago stopped paying teachers who were known to faint in front of their classes from lack of food. There was a lot of that going around, not just in teachers. Simultaneously, or almost simultaneously, the ecological disaster that came to be called the Dust Bowl was afflicting the middle of the country, creating an almost literal scar of desiccated farmland that practically ran from the Canadian border down to the Gulf. Crop failures meant not only a loss of income for farmers and a loss of food for, well, everyone, but it meant a lack of fodder for livestock, which meant dying animals, whether those animals were around for labor or to become meat or to provide milk. And that meant that farmers, who had been in bad straits for years because of falling prices, were starving too. Let me quote one more time Meridel Lesueur, who was one of many reporters to file from inside that scar. When you drive through the Middle West droughty country, you try not to look at the thrusting out ribs of the horses and cows, but you get so you can't see anything else but ribs, like hundreds of thousands of little beached hulks. It looks like the bones are rising right up out of the skin. Pretty soon, quite gradually, you begin to know that the farmer, under his rags, shows his ribs too, and the farmer's wife is as lean as his cows, and his children look tiny and hungry. On Decoration Day, the wind started again, blowing hot as a blast from hell, and the young corn withered as if under machine gun fire. The trees, in 2 hours, looked as if they had been beaten. The day after Decoration Day, it was so hot you couldn't sit around looking at the panting cattle and counting their ribs and listening to that low cry that is an awful asking. We got in the car and drove slowly through the sizzling countryside. Not a soul was in sight. It was like a funeral. The houses were closed up tight, the blinds drawn, the windows and doors closed. There seemed to be a menace in the air made visible. It was frightening. You could hear the fields crack and dry, and the only movement in the down-driving heat was the dead writhing of the dry, blighted leaves on the twigs. The young corn about 4 spears up was falling down, like a fountain being slowly turned off. There was something terrifying about this visible sign of disaster. It went into your nostrils so you couldn't breathe. The smell of hunger. It made you count your own ribs with terror. You don't starve in America. Everything looks good. There is something around the corner. Everyone has a chance. That's all over now. The whole country cracks and rumbles and cries out in its terrible leanness, stripped with exploitation and terror, and as sign and symbol, bones. Bones showing naked and spiritless, showing decay and crisis, and a terrific warning. Bare and lean in mid-America. The whole countryside that afternoon became terrifying, not only with its present famine, but with the foreshadowing of its coming hunger. No vegetables now, and worst of all, no milk. The countryside became monstrous with this double doom. Every house is alike in suffering as in a flood. Every cow, every field mounting into hundreds and thousands from state to state. You try not to look at the ribs, but pretty soon you are looking only at ribs. Starvation stands up in the blazing sun, naked at last, and bare and lean ribs for all the coming winter. I'm jumping around a little because the way I want to order my examples isn't identical to the timeline, and I should point out that even before the farms dried up, there was hunger in the cities due to incredibly high unemployment. How do you get into a deflationary spiral? Everyone in America had bought everything they might have wanted in the 1920s, iceboxes, radios, cars, often on credit. Factories kept churning them out anyway, but no one was buying. Prices dropped, profit margins thinned and vanished, the factories closed, jobs went away, banks started calling in their loans. The end. Although there was actually a lot more to it than that, this was a huge international calamity. It had a lot of fathers, a lot of mothers, and again, there are whole books still to this day. One just came out, written about the origins of the crisis, and they don't all agree. Simultaneously, our government, both under President Hoover and initially under President Roosevelt, tried to figure out what was appropriate for the federal government to do when the people were hungry. Hoover felt very strongly that it was the government's job to help banks and major companies like railroads so they could return to employing people, but individual relief was a job for your local food pantry or place of worship. What you were supposed to eat between now and when he got the factories reopened, if he got them reopened, especially with millions of Americans needing help from that local food pantry, which only started with 3 cans of beans to begin with, we're still waiting on him to answer that one. He was, in all seriousness, willing to purchase fodder for those starving farm animals, but not fodder for the people who owned them. There was a great, painful line in a report filed to the Bureau of Government Research in June 1937 that highlighted the consequence of this sort of thinking. Many a relief recipient receives less for one day's food than is spent in some households for a dog. And although children, like monkeys in zoos, need fresh lettuce, bananas, oranges, and spinach, only the monkeys are assured these necessities. Note, I said that was in 1937. Hoover had been out of the picture for almost 5 years at that point. But the Roosevelt administration, because of the traditional American avoidance of helping people out directly, because it allowed them to be shamed by the opposition, kept stepping back from these programs. The main program that I'm about to discuss, which was the grandpa of SNAP, at times Franklin Roosevelt would say, okay, wind it up. And the government would start pulling people off of assistance, even if they weren't in a place where they could do without it. Well, there are consequences. People don't just magically have money because you say they should. Thus, after visits to 1,300 families who had been on relief, I think in Philadelphia, investigators said of the families they saw, several, some of them including children, were reduced to the point of actual hunger much of the time. They had practically nothing to eat except occasional surplus products, food supplied by friends or neighbors, and fruit salvaged from garbage at the markets. Another found one family whose chief subsistence had been on scraps supplied them from the tables of a nearby restaurant whose proprietor thought the family was getting them for the dog. Here's a similar thought from Hitting Home, edited by Bernard Sturcher, a collection of pieces exploring the local impact of the Depression. This is characterizing a survey of 400 representative families. These people lived from one day to another with no dependable income. A common source of food was the docks, where fruit and vegetables were sold for market. People gathered around stalls and snatched at anything cast out. Hunger occasionally motivated street begging and petty thievery of milk and groceries from doorsteps. Playing on the sympathy of storekeepers, children forced tears down their cheeks to induce them to offer a little food. After citing these examples, the study concluded, families visited did not starve to death when relief stopped. They kept alive from day to day, catch as catch can, reduced for actual subsistence to something of a stray cat prowling for food, for which a kindly soul sets out a plate of table scraps or a saucer of milk. We're going to turn to the baseball of all this in just a couple of minutes. Do you mind if I give you a few more examples? I've got dozens and I can't give them all to you, but I do want to give you just a few more. I want to highlight the role of school lunches in all of this. There's a reason we have school lunches. It's not just that kids get hungry being in school for 6 hours and you gotta feed them something, but because society worried that they weren't getting enough food at home. Here I quote from The Invisible Scar, which is about the long-term impact of the Depression on those who lived through it. A teacher in a mountain school told a little girl who looked sick but said she was hungry to go home and eat something. "I can't," the youngster said. "It's my sister's turn to eat." In Chicago, teachers were ordered to ask what a child had had to eat before punishing him. Many of them were getting nothing but potatoes, a diet that kept their weight up but left them listless, crotchety, and sleepy. Teachers worried about the children who came to school to get warm. They organized help for youngsters who needed food and clothing before they could learn. Sometimes, boards of education diverted school funds to feed them. Often the teachers did it on their own. In 1932, New York City school teachers contributed $260,000 out of their salaries in 1 month. Chicago teachers fed 11,000 pupils out of their own pockets in 1931, although they had not been themselves paid for months. For God's sake, help us feed these children during the summer, Chicago's superintendent of schools begged the governor in June. It was not true that no one starved. The author put that in quotes because it was something that Herbert Hoover insisted. No one has starved. People starved to death, and not only in Harlan County, Kentucky. The New York City Welfare Council counted 29 deaths from starvation in 1933. More than 50 other people were treated for starvation in hospitals. An additional 110, most of them children, died of malnutrition. A father who had been turned away by a New York City welfare agency was afraid to apply for help after public relief had been set up. Social workers found one of his children dead. Another, too weak to move, lay in bed with the mother, the rest huddled, shivering and hungry, around the desperate father. Like I said, I have pages and pages of notes like this, but I'm going to stop here. The point is that this really happened here in America not that long ago, and that's why we started these programs. Not to abandon capitalism, not to become socialistic, not to become communistic, but actually to save capitalism, to round off some of its rougher edges at the time that it can't support all of us, which is pretty much all the time. It just happened that in the 1930s, that included a lot more people than usual, and that required us to rethink how we do things, and then subsequently to forget why we changed them, to have our hearts harden again. It's foolish and it's short-sighted, but I'm overdue to take a break, so I'll complete that point in just a minute. I hope you'll hang with me. Just after that, we'll turn to the World Series of 1933. You all won't see this, but my podcast platform, if I don't put in enough breaks, they would kind of threaten to do it for you. I don't think I've ever gotten into that situation, to just have them randomly appear rather than where I've indicated they should be. But when I started the show, their attitude was that, yeah, a break every 20 minutes or so, that would be okay. And I've more or less kept to that. But I don't know, the last couple of years, maybe with our own economic stresses, with the decline of the ad market, they're slightly more aggressive about that. What I mean is, on my page that shows how I've set up each episode, I get kind of this scarlet A, except it's a dollar sign. And it seems to be suggesting, you idiot, you're leaving money on the table. I kind of doubt it, but more to the point, as I explained last week, I'm very sensitive to taxing you, so to speak. I don't want to overfill the show with interruptions. As a listener, I would find that annoying. Just another glimpse into how the sausage is made around here. Returning to the subject at hand. What's fascinating to me is that you can justify these programs on a humanitarian basis, or you can justify them because you know your history and you're aware that hunger leads to unrest and revolution. You still might be so conservative you don't want to do too much, lest the underclasses get lazy and dependent, but you know that doing it is for your own good. In the book, The WPA and Federal Relief Policy, author Donald S. Howard highlighted an exchange from an old radio show, you can still find these, called The Town Hall of the Air, a political discussion program which, as far as I know, did not have good coffee ads. In a 1940 episode, these same questions were asked, as Howard wrote, although from a legal point of view, the question appears to be settled, that relief giving is a proper function of the federal, as well as of state and local governments. The terms self-preservation and general welfare are much too vague to be of material help in determining how far government should carry these responsibilities. From what is the state to preserve itself? Starvation? Robbery? Riot? Revolution? Or must subtler aspects also be taken into account? Does the preservation of the state call for measures that will prevent malnutrition, forestall public resentment over the relative resourcelessness of millions of citizens, safeguard against the deterioration of morale, or preserve families and homes? The term general welfare is no easier of definition than preservation of the state and provides no better objective basis for measuring the extent to which governmental relief measures could or should be carried. Concrete illustration of how consideration of relief measures is clouded by uncertainty as to how far these should go was provided in a radio broadcast in which Henry S. Dennison, president of Dennison Manufacturing Company, declared, "At the hard minimum, enough must be paid to avoid hunger marches piling on top of each other to social revolution. Any form of government would do that much. The difficulties and differences of opinion begin when, for one reason or another, more than preventative policy measures are to be undertaken, and questions as to just how much someone else should be able to live on provoke fantastic disagreements. To my own preferences, if we are to go beyond the minimum based upon prevention of revolution, we should choose such higher levels as relief as will save us from serious deterioration in the character and morale of those in need." Another speaker, A. Ballantyne, New York attorney and one-time undersecretary of the Treasury, declared, "We shouldn't let anybody starve, and we shouldn't let anybody be unclothed. We all agree on that. But the question of just what is adequate is a question that we have to discuss a great deal, for this is very elastic." And we're still arguing about that, because if we are, in the view of some people, overly charitable, we're enabling people. And if we're not sufficient in what we give them, then we're not just hurting them, we're hurting ourselves. And one very concrete example of that I've pointed out many times on this program is that when we needed to draft American boys for World War II service, a lot of them had to be turned down due to the effects of the malnutrition they suffered in this exact period. American League Baseball in the 1930s was dominated by 4 teams. The Browns were, as was typical, lost. The Red Sox needed until the end of the decade to shake off their post-Frizzy torpor under new owner Tom Yawkey, and the White Sox floated between mere competence and last place. Cleveland had 9 first division finishes without ever getting close to winning, which is to say they were entertaining but not highly competitive. That meant the A's, having already won the pennant in 1929, repeated in 1930 and 1931 before tearing down, in part in reaction to Connie Mack's stock market losses after the crash. The Yankees snuck in 1932, but then needed to reload because Babe Ruth began to age out at the same time the pitching staff thinned out badly. The Senators took advantage of that in 1933, and the Tigers in 1934 and 1935, and at that point, the Yankees came roaring back into the age of Joe DiMaggio and won 4 straight pennants, and indeed 4 consecutive World Series from 1936 through 1939. The 1932 Senators went 93-61 under Walter Johnson. That was only good enough for third place, 15 games behind a Yankees team that won 107 games. That winter, owner Clark Griffith, who would suffer from extreme lethargy later in his career, made a bunch of trades that paid off in 1933. He took journeyman righty Dick Kaufman and traded him to the Browns for younger lefty Carl Fisher, then put him together with veteran swingman Fred Firpo Marbury and sent them on to Detroit in return for veteran lefty Earl Whitehill. Whitehill, just 5'9", had been up and down for the Tigers in his 10-year run with the team, but he pitched extremely well for the Senators in 1933, going 22-8 with a 3.33 ERA. The same day Griffith made that trade, he made a much bigger one, sending 2 of his starting outfielders, Sam West and Carl Reynolds, as well as starting pitcher Lloyd Brown and $20,000, to the Browns in return for old pal Goose Goslin, the outfielder. He was normally a left fielder, and he had a permanently injured arm, but he'd play a lot of right in 1933 because another future Hall of Famer, Heine Manush, was in left. That deal also brought center fielder Fred Schulte and left-handed starter Lefty Stewart. Goslin would not be at his best in 1933, but Schulte played a good defensive center field while hitting .296 with 61 walks, and Stewart would go 15-6 with a 3.82 ERA. West was a real loss, and Griffith knew it, but he needed to let go of him to make the package work, because there was an overarching goal here. The goal was to get the lefties that would beat the Yankees. The next day, Griffith sent first base prospect Elmer Harley Lefty Boss to Cleveland and got pitcher Jack Russell in return. He would take over Marbury's fireman role and go 12-6 with a league-leading 13 saves and a 2.69 ERA. It was a fluke year. For one thing, he allowed a 2.67 average on balls in play against a career average of 3.05, but of fluke years are championships made. Finally, in January, Griffith made another trade with Cleveland. Washington's catching had been offensively and defensively poor in 1932, and so he swapped veteran catchers, sending out Roy Spencer and getting back Luke Sewell. Sewell couldn't hit much, although he would be near the top of his range in 1933, but he was a good glove and was regarded as a brain. Cleveland's manager, old Washington star and GOAT Roger Peckinpah, didn't get along with Sewell and so made the disadvantageous deal. By then, Griffith had also let Walter Johnson go. As a player, Johnson was a pussycat, but as a manager, he was an out-of-touch grump. His replacement was 26-year-old blockhead, shortstop and son-in-law, well, future son-in-law, Joe Cronin. "Cronin's a scrapper," Griffith said. "He thinks nothing but baseball. I like these young fellas who fight for everything." Managing aside, Cronin would be a 7-win player in 1933, hitting .309 with a .398 on-base percentage and a .445 slugging percentage, with 45 doubles, 11 triples, 5 home runs, and 118 RBIs. Johnson would eventually end up in Cleveland, just like his former catcher. The 1933 World Series, which lasted only 5 games, spanned October 3rd to October 7th. The regular season had ended on October 1st, so no ceremony, no delay. Neither race was close, so the likely World Series match had been set since August. The Giants went into first place to stay in mid-June and pulled away in mid-August. The Senators hit the approximate one-third point of the season, 6 games behind, trailing the Yankees and White Sox, but they came together at that point, going 24-6 over the next month. By the end of that stretch, they had gone past the leaders into first. Their lead narrowed to 1 game in early August, but a 13-game winning streak in the middle of the month put paid to the race. With their good southpaws, they had gone 14-8 against the Yankees as well. One of the great plays in Senators history, which was also one of the worst plays in Yankees history, at least until Del Berra and Bobby Meacham matched it in 1985, took place in 1933. On April 29th, the Senators were playing the Yankees in New York. Senators righty Monty Weaver was on the mound trying to finish out a 6-2 win. Babe Ruth led off with a single and left in favor of pinch runner Sammy Bird, remembered as Babe Ruth's legs. Lou Gehrig singled, moving Bird to second, and Dixie Walker lined a single the other way, scoring Bird and pushing Gehrig, running on his own legs, to second base. Weaver clearly had nothing left, but you already know how I feel about Cronin. Tony Lazzeri was up next, and he too singled, this time to right field. That's 4 consecutive hits to open the 9th. However, big however, Lazzeri's hit may look like a line drive in the box score, as the cliche goes, but depending on which description you believe, it was either a looping fly or a high pop that just dropped in. Gehrig held second, while Walker, thinking it would drop, ran up his back. Seemingly everybody in the ballpark knew the drive would fall safe, wrote Shirley Povich of the Washington Post, with the exception of Gehrig. By the time he took off, said the Daily News, Walker wasn't any further behind Gehrig than his flying shirt tails. Goslin got the ball in quickly despite his bad arm, and Cronin, acting as the relay man, made a perfect throw home. Sewell was able to tag Gehrig and Walker in quick succession, pinwheeling from one to the other. Double play. Bill Dickey made the last out, and the Yankees lost 6-3. Yankees steal Dodgers act was the headline. Wasn't I just talking about the 3 men on third thing on this show about a week ago? That's the kind of stunt they were referring to. Rudd Rennie, who was with the New York Herald Tribune forever and was very much an above-average baseball writer, began his gamer this way. Once in a lifetime, if one is lucky, he may see a play like that with which the Washington Senators took the Yankees out of a rushing 9th-inning rally in the stadium yesterday afternoon. It was a double play at the home plate. Luke Sewell, the catcher, flinging himself from one runner to another as they came piling in. At 1 minute, the Yankees rally was in full swing amid the noisy encouragement of 34,455 fans. The next minute, both base runners were out at the plate, and a moment later, the game was over. Scrutinizing this sudden termination of what might have been a winning inning, the blaming finger points to Lou Gehrig, who delayed his start just long enough for the speedy Walker to be at his heels before he rounded third base. Further explanation. Confronted with these two runners going full speed, third base coach Art Fletcher was helpless. "I wanted to send Gehrig in and stop Walker," he explained later, but Walker took the "come on" signal to include him. So he came on. Like the Senators, the Giants had a player manager, taciturn, saturnine first baseman Bill Terry. Unlike the Senators, he went with his best pitcher, lefty screwball master Carl Hubbell, who during the regular season had one of the best seasons in modern baseball history. Still, I think. He had gone 23-12 with a 1.66 ERA, which was like half the league average. He pitched 308 2/3 innings. He threw 10 shutouts and struck out 156 while walking only 47. He was ridiculously good. Now here's what's strange. Hearing Terry say that he would start Carl Hubbell in Game 1, which had to be like the worst kept secret in two hemispheres, not just one, he acted like it was a total surprise. What? Terry is going to start his staff ace? The guy who's going to be a by acclamation MVP? Are you nuts? I can't believe it. And refused to name a Game 1 starter. I've really got to think about this, fellas. I just don't. This Carl Hubbell thing changes everything. Mother? He eventually chose his third best starter, Lefty Stewart, instead of either of his aces, Alvin Crowder or the aforementioned Mr. Whitehill. Before Game 1, Babe Ruth had said, "The Senators have too much punch. It may not be as much as the Yankees had last year, but it will be enough to give the Giants trouble. And don't overlook that the Senators have a strong defense too. We found that out, but I'm not underestimating the Giants, who have a great pitcher in Hubbell. If he wins the opening game, it may mean a 6 or 7 game series. And if Hubbell can beat the Senators often enough, the Giants have a chance. But if he loses the opener, it will practically be all over." That Babe Ruth, he knew his apples. Hubbell won the first game 4-2, allowing no earned runs and striking out 10, including the side in the top of the first. Master Melvin Ott hit a 2-run homer in the bottom of the inning, and we'll talk about this a little more in a second, but Hubbell came back in Game 4 and allowed 1 run in 11 innings. That 2 was unearned, walked 4, whiffed 5. Terry backed him with a homer. That was 20 innings in the World Series with an ERA of 0.00. And now, after a quick break, we're going to rewind half a second and knit all of this together. At least I hope so. Do you think I can do it? I think we can do it together. And we will begin on the other side. Stay with me through this last break of the episode, please, and I'll catch you then. The first game of the World Series, the Hubbell start, which Babe Ruth was so prescient about, took place on October 3rd. That day, Harry Hopkins, the head of the Federal Emergency Relief Program, a social worker by trade, was in New York City announcing the beginning of a new program. He had just met with President Roosevelt. Now, Hopkins' goal as Federal Emergency Relief Administrator was to get jobs for the unemployed, food to the hungry, and coal to the cold. He did this without regard to political affiliation. As his colleague Robert Sherwood later wrote, he was specifically instructed by the president never to ask whether a person needing relief is a Republican, Democrat, Socialist, or anything else. Confident of Roosevelt's support, Hopkins continued for a long time on the principle that relief was entirely nonpartisan, for that was a period of soaring altruism. Sherwood wrote that because of former President Hoover's antipathy to public support of individuals, when Franklin Roosevelt came into office and took over relief programs, I quote, "The main burden of cost and of administration was still on the local authorities to whom the needy must go, cap in hand, to accept charity." That is precisely where Hopkins came in and produced a profound change in the whole conception of governmental responsibility and function. That is, he and Roosevelt felt that it was the government's responsibility to deliver aid to citizens in crisis. Earlier, I quoted you an author who said, well, it seems to be a settled matter. It wasn't, and it isn't. Hopkins, Sherwood said, spoke out in favor of relief as an obligation of the federal government to the citizens, without any pretense of private agencies interposed, thereby putting into effect the Roosevelt doctrine that this relief was a sacred right rather than an act of charity, an obligation of government to its citizens rather than a mere emergency alleviation of suffering in the form of alms. Again, not everyone even today would agree with that. A lot of people would disagree with it. As the World Series was about to start, Hopkins proposed to Roosevelt that in terms of dealing with the food shortage, the government should be taking farm animals that it wanted to kill off and actually fatten them up as food. I should have mentioned this before, even before the soil dried up and just quit blowing all over the country, just like the millions of kids then riding the rails looking for work. They too were blowing all over the country looking for food. The government was trying to figure out how to raise farm prices. And one possibility, which they pursued and upset a lot of people, was slaughtering, say, thousands of young pigs to bring up the price of pork. This was upsetting both because it was wasteful and, well, because piglets are cute. Initially, Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace, who had a farm background and therefore probably wasn't real sentimental about animals, complained that people felt that every little pig has the right to attain before slaughter the full pigginess of his pigness. To hear them talk, you would have thought that pigs were raised for pets. Here's the thing about the federal government, even in 1933. When it works right, it is very large, because this is a very large continent-sized country with a lot of people in it who need it to run well and need a lot of services, and one consequence of that is that sometimes the left hand of the bureaucracy doesn't know what the right hand is doing, even someone as highly placed as the Secretary of Agriculture. And so the left hand says something that's really tone deaf. In this case, it really wasn't that the people were thinking of the three little pigs, but the three little lunches that they and others had been forced to skip. And Hopkins made that point to the president. Wherever there were food surpluses, he said, they should be shifted to where there was a food deficit. He put it in political terms. If there were great food surpluses while people went hungry, he said, the public could rightly be revolted. Roosevelt was sold and drafted an executive order starting up the Federal Surplus Commodities Corporation. We'll be going in a week, Hopkins said, which is to say the program began at the same time as the World Series, would be set up by the time it was over, and would keep going afterwards. Hopkins was especially conscious that winter was coming. We are going to get enough coal to see that these people are warm this winter, and that goes all along the line. He also insisted the food would be healthful and good and not refuse like salt, pork, and beans. And a bonus was that the program would assist in raising commodity prices by the placement of surpluses through channels that otherwise could not purchase them. A great example of this, by the way, that kind of vexes me, even though it's so many years later. Later in the history of this program, the government was picking up, among other surplus items, the materials that could go into making mattresses. And the mattress companies got upset because the federal government was competing with them. No, said Harry Hopkins, we're giving them to people who are indigent. They're not your market. They are not going to buy your fancy mattress with the topper on it. Aw, shucks, well, fine. But it's so reflexively greedy. And maybe the program started with those pigs who otherwise would have been thrown away. But as Nick Taylor wrote in his WPA history, American Made, in 1934, as the operation grew more sophisticated, it expanded to include beef and veal, butter and cheese, wheat and flour, potatoes and rice, cereal, apples, cabbage, sweet potatoes, sugar, and corn syrup. It distributed heating fuel, mostly in the form of coal. It bought raw wool and had it processed into blankets that went to relief families, and almost 120,000 bales of surplus cotton was made into clothing or bedclothes at federal emergency sewing operations. The corporation also purchased feed and seed that allowed drought-stricken farmers to maintain their stock and to plant again. More than 650 million pounds of dressed canned beef went to relief families, along with countless blankets and pairs of shoes. Hopkins' speech in New York announced and defended the program. It's indefensible. to have food rotting on the ground or packed up in warehouses, some of it belonging to speculators, while people don't eat. Of all the absurd things in the world, that's the most absurd I ever heard. Now, we intend to get those surpluses. We intend to get them right away. There are some people who still think that these people on relief are naturally or entirely made up of the unemployables, the bums, the drunkards, people who could never get on. You know perfectly well that's absurd. You've got a cross-section of the American people on this relief roll, the finest people in America, mainly working people, because in the main, it's been the workers that have taken the beating in this depression. I know I promised I wouldn't say this too often, but when was the last time you heard that kind of common sense and it got any kind of play whatsoever? The Giants won the second game of the World Series behind Hal Schumacher, their second best pitcher, and a very good one. The Senators took Game 3 when Whitehill outpitched Freddie Fitzsimmons 4-0. He held the Giants, Whitehill did, to 5 hits and 2 walks. As I said earlier, Hubble's second start came in Game 4. The Senators nearly came back in that one. After the Giants went up by a run in the top of the 11th, the Senators loaded the bases against Hubble with 1 out in the bottom of the inning. Today, the starters would have been long gone, but it was a different time. With the pitcher spot up, Cronin sent in reserve catcher Cliff Bolton to pinch hit. The Senators thought so little of Bolton's catching abilities that they barely let him play in the field. They hardly let him play at all. But he had hit .410 on the season, going 9 for 21 as a pinch hitter. At the last second, as Bolton was stepping in, Giants coach Chuck Dressen called time and repositioned shortstop Blondie Ryan. He knew Bolton from the minors and thought the left-handed hitter should be played more to pull. Bolton hit it right to him, 6-4-3 double play, and the game was over. A guy who practically couldn't make an out during the regular season. Game 5 was tied at 3-3 through 9. Hal Schumacher versus General Crowder, but it was settled by other pitchers and extras, so a more modern game. Ott homered off of Jack Russell in the latter's 5th inning of work, landing a ball in temporary bleachers that Griffith had set up in anticipation of overflow ticket sales that didn't happen due to the sheer amount of poverty going on. Former Reds great Dolph Luke, working in relief for the Giants, pitched 4 1/3 scoreless innings to keep the Senators off the board after the 6th. The Giants win! The Giants win! And the Senators, in terms of winning pennants, were history. But did America win? To this day, there are books coming out arguing about whether the New Deal ended the Great Depression. Publishers love to put those out, and conservatives love to write them. It's been 93 years since Franklin Roosevelt was first elected, but some folks are still not over it. I've always been fine with the idea that the New Deal was only a partial success because it was only a partial fix. As we discussed earlier, because of the American prejudice against government intervention in the economy, against aid to the poor, even if they're middle-class people who are temporarily poor, because of the Supreme Court blocking some of the program, not everything that could have been done or should have been done was done. They were afraid, those New Dealers, in the sense that what they were doing was, as Sherwood wrote, a redefinition, a reinvention of government, and they didn't know how Americans would take it. People kept telling them they had to stop, and so sometimes they did. It was World War II that solved the problem of employment in America, because then the government really started spending money on employment. Hopkins, before that, sometimes gave people jobs counting butterflies just so they could have the dignity of work. He got a lot of grief for that. Now the government was paying those same people to make ball bearings for tanks, and that was cool with the anti-butterfly people. Hopkins' argument that sometimes you just got to count butterflies, okay? The scientists say this is a beneficial program, okay? Didn't wash with them. But guns and bombs were all good, even if some of them were or still are unsure if we were fighting the right people at that time. He also had people painting pictures and writing plays and things of that nature. Why? Because those people had to eat too. So why discriminate? There's a simpler, narrower question to ask than, did the New Deal end the Depression? It's simply this. Did it keep people from eating garbage or starving? The answer to that is yes. And that's a huge moral, humanitarian victory that should be sufficient unto itself. That's why, long after the Depression did end, we continue to offer assistance to those in need. And although the government is no longer grabbing pigs and packaging them up in cans for the poor, the vouchers, that the poor receive, whether the old-style food stamps or the debit-type cards that they now have, is exactly what Harry Hopkins was doing, in the sense that he was taking a surplus of pigs somewhere, or shirts, or mattresses, and sending them across this big land of ours to a place where there was a paucity of those things. So instead of going to waste, they would do someone some good. And what we do now is we take money where there's a surplus of that, and we move it to people who don't have enough. And for them, it does some good. Again, it's not a lot. In my state, per household member per day, $6.38, topping out at $194 per household per month. In Kansas, just to pick a state at random, $182 per household per month, or $5.98 for each household member per day. It's good for them to receive it. It's better for us to give it. It lifts both the giver and recipient in different ways, and only a sociopath would fail to understand it. It lifts the entire economy and the safety and security and stability of the nation. Say you wanted to make America great again. I don't know when you noticed that it wasn't. I don't agree that it wasn't. But in any case, say you were supposedly dedicated to that, then you wouldn't balk at feeding America for a moment. On October 31st, Georgia's Senator, the Reverend Raphael Warnock, said, "It's a sad day when a judge has to order the President of the United States to feed vulnerable families and hungry children with funds already designated for that very purpose." It's also a sad day when a pennant-winning manager saves his best pitcher for Game 3, but the ship sailed on that decision a long time ago. We can't affect it. However, we still have time to demand that our fellow Americans, our old ones and young ones in particular, not go hungry because those in power not only lack common sense like Joe Cronin did, but lack human feeling. As you no doubt know by now, the Dodgers escaped by the skin of their teeth, and we will have a Game 7. It's amazing how bullpen issues are like a chronic disease that recurs. It's like malaria. You think you're past it, and then it's back. You know what else is back? Social media, and you can back me on it by following me at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us by, which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning. That's all there is to it. And should you wish to back the show, you can do so at patreon.com/The Infinite Inning. And I thank you very kindly for helping to keep me and my family in pancakes. As ever, there is gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, go donate to your local food bank. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who reminds us that Montesquieu wrote that republics tend to end through luxury and monarchies through poverty, so ain't it a kick in the head when you reap what someone else has sown? Well, if I can get through just one more World Series game and then survive the inevitable deflating feeling that comes with the sunsetting of a baseball season, I'll be back next week and all winter long with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.